We now arrive in our time in looking at narrative genre, this aspect of looking at parables. Parables are something kind of unique that you're going to find within the narrative genre, especially in the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke primarily, maybe even in some of the other passages, but parables was what Jesus used to get his point across, to tell people what he wanted them to know. And so let me briefly define parables for you, and then we'll look at a procedure of how to interpret them and how to understand them. Parables were a favorite teaching tool of Jesus, as he told 39 of them in the Gospels. You'll find about 39 of them, unique parables. He used parables to communicate truth to those who he had enabled to understand them. But he also spoke parables to give people who he didn't want to understand them, to hide truth from them. So on the one hand, it served as a way for people to understand the truth. On the other hand, though, it was a way for them to be more blinded to the truth. That's kind of an interesting thing. And in a parable, what a parable is just it's a story. But it's like a narrative within a narrative. It's what I call an embedded narrative, a narrative that's embedded within a larger narrative. It's used to communicate a purposeful theological truth. Remember, I told you at the very beginning of the narrative course that parables are that narrative is the text is in the narrative genre in order to communicate theological truth by the story that it's trying to tell. Parables are a part of that. Parables are also communicating a theological truth. That's why Jesus would use it. There would be a theological truth that he would want them to know, or maybe certain people not to know. And what a parable does, it uses analogies to help readers understand biblical truth by placing familiar objects from everyday life alongside of the spiritual reality that would be unfamiliar to them. If they could understand the physical reality that's common to their life, hopefully the idea is that they could grasp the spiritual truth that corresponds to that, is the idea. Like Jesus would talk about farming, casting seed into the ground. The sower went out to sow. That's the idea of planting and harvesting and farming. And the people in that day should understand that picture. They should be able to, okay, I can see that happening. Now, they may not have understood the spiritual truth that corresponded to that physical reality. But Jesus would use a physical reality with the hopes of them understanding a spiritual truth or a spiritual reality that would be unfamiliar to them, but then would become more familiar. So that's kind of in a nutshell what a parable is. Think of it like a narrative within a narrative. So how do you go about understanding it? Well, since it is a narrative, that means it's a separate story, that it's embedded within a larger story. And so the way you implement a exegetical procedure to study this is you first start with the main narrative of the passage, minus the parable. So you subtract out the parable, think about the main narrative passage, and so what are you going to do? You're going to do character analysis, setting analysis, scene analysis, plot analysis, and along the way you're going to make textual observations, historical background, do your historical situation, and you're going to look at significant words. So you do that for the main narrative. You also, though, have to do that for every single parable. Now, if it's just one parable, if your passage is in a parable by itself, that's it, there's nothing else to it, then you may just have still one story. But usually usually the parable is told in light of some bigger story. So you're going to really normally have this narrative embedded within a larger narrative. So you start with the broader narrative passage and look at the characters, the setting, the scene, and the plot, even though there's not many verses to that maybe. Then for the parable itself, you do the same thing. It is a separate story. So you need to isolate the characters within that parable. You need to isolate the setting within that parable, the scenes within that parable, and the plot within that parable. That's how this works. But the new added thing to it is when you're studying the characters, the setting, the scene, and the plot of the parable itself, you're asking yourself the question, not what, why, how, as much as what is the teaching point? What is the teaching point of that parable? What is the succinct thing, spiritual reality? Jesus may be talking about a physical reality. He's trying to get them to understand a spiritual reality. What is that spiritual reality? What is that teaching point, that spiritual truth that he wants them to grasp? You need to be able to discover that. Because then, when you understand the parable and you understand the teaching point, then you can see how it connects back to the main flow of the narrative passage. Then what you do is, after you've studied the broad narrative and then the parable itself, then you update the plot analysis of the main narrative portion to incorporate that teaching point within the larger flow. And then you'll move on to work on primary matters for the entire passage. So the one thing that parables do is it's still a separate story. So a story is a story. It has characters, it has settings, it has scenes. But it's not usually on its own. It's a part of some larger narrative that Jesus has been describing, like Jesus is interacting with the Pharisees. He says something to them. They say something to him. He says something back. And then he's trying to prove a spiritual point to them, make a spiritual point to them. But instead of just saying it directly, he wants to tell a story to get his point across. And that's what a parable is. So that's how you got to do this. Now, the best way for me to show you this is kind of walk through an example. I'm going to begin a process of walking through Luke chapter 15. That's a very lengthy chapter. There's a narrative there, but it's only a few verses. But there's 3 parables. Now, I'm not going to go through every single parable in detail. We're actually going to spend more time in class on this, okay? We're actually going to go back through some of this, a large portion of this, in class. So I want to just give you enough overview of it to get you acquainted with what we're going to do in class, but to kind of let you get a picture of how this works. So anyway, now let's move to the example, and I think this will help you with the understanding the procedure a little bit better. So now what we have is what I call 3 connected parables. They are connected together, and Jesus is going to use these parables to try to prove a spiritual reality, a spiritual point to the Pharisees. Now, the main narrative encompasses the entire chapter. Chapter 15, verses 1 to 32. So when you look at that, though, you got to begin at the beginning and start with characters. So you see here on the page and in your notes, character analysis. There's Jesus. I label him as the protagonist. The Pharisees and scribes are clearly the antagonists. The tax collectors and sinners, they're mentioned. They're the foil. And then you have the narrator, which is Luke himself. So I'm not going to go through the details of all that, but I broke it down into the 4 characters and described a little bit about each, okay? Then I'm looking at the setting analysis. So I look at the physical aspects. He's located in the land of Judea, near Jerusalem. We learn that from chapter 13, starting in verse 34. This event took place outdoors. We learn that from chapter 14, verse 25. So that gives you a little bit of idea of the physical aspects. Cultural aspects, Pharisees and scribes, this is the background to everything. When you read those initial 3 verses or so, you realize that there's a situation going on here. And so the cultural part of this is that the Pharisees and scribes, they taught that it was forbidden to associate with tax collectors and sinners. They taught that. That was their theological position. You don't even associate with those kinds of people. We're better than those kinds of people. And so they saw Jesus as violating that perspective, that teaching. For Jesus to be with those who were of the tax collectors and the sinners, those categories of society, they saw that as wrong. Well, Jesus did not. He didn't agree with him. And so I deal with the cultural aspects. Then we deal with the other aspects like the biblical writer, the biblical audience. And again, you should be familiar with this. The broader context here. Who are the tax collectors and the sinners? Since those classifications come up, who are those people? Who are the Pharisees and scribes? So then I deal with the broader context of the story. So I've done character analysis, I've done setting analysis, then I move to scene analysis, and I begin doing textual observations on this. Now, when I get to the shifts and the pivots, I realize that there is this that this grumbling pivots to Jesus responding to the Pharisees and scribes, and that starts in verse 3 and goes to verse 32, which is the context of the three parables. Then I look at particular aspects. Scene 1, which is verse 1 and 2. I describe that scene. I give the themes for that scene, my thoughts and emotions. But then I realize that scene 2 it's a continuation, yes. The story is continuing, but how is the story continuing? The story is continuing by Jesus responding to the Pharisees and scribes by presenting 3 connected parables. So it's not yes, the story is continuing, but it's continuing in a different way. Instead of there being another action sequence or another conversation per se, now Jesus launches into 3 parables. He launches into 3 parables. And so now I have to incorporate that. I realize that there's really only 2 scenes here in the whole story. But that scene 2 is very lengthy. It's Jesus monologuing. No interruptions. He's just like monologuing, but it's not a sermon. It is parables because he states them that way. And he just tells these directly to the Pharisees and scribes who were bringing up this issue. So the plot analysis would be this. There's an opening situation, chapter 15, verse 1. There's the problem, chapter 15, verse 2. What happens in verses 3 to 32? What happens with these parables? What are these parables doing? What is Jesus trying to accomplish with these parables? He's trying to bring resolution. So there's no climax here. There's no trying to solve the problem. It's just 3 of the categories. But there may be more later. But what I know right now is that there's this resolution, these parables that I need to examine. Because that launches into that. So let me just look at the first parable, and then I think in class we're going to go over the other parables a little bit more detailed. But again, I'm just trying to give you a kind of an idea of what's happening here. Okay, since the parable is a separate story, I'm going to isolate it and treat it like a separate story. So that means I got to do character analysis on it, setting analysis, scene analysis. So character analysis, this is the story of the lost sheep. It's verses 3 to 7. So there's an owner here who has 100 sheep. He's the protagonist. There's a lost sheep. He's the antagonist. And then there's the friends and neighbors. That's the foil. And then I describe each one. The setting analysis, I have to understand what is a sheepfold. Because the context here of this parable, of this story, is this happens in the midst of a sheep being in a sheepfold. And then, the sheep is lost, and then the sheep is found. And then the one sheep is found and brought back. And then there's rejoicing. So what would a rejoicing be like for a shepherd and sheep? How would that work? So I talk about that. Then with scene analysis, I'm doing textual observations again, going through all that process. And then the plot analysis of the parable itself. There's an opening situation, there's a problem, there's trying to solve the problem, resolution, closing situation. Now the plot, by doing all that, that's helping me get to the teaching point. The teaching point. That's the goal of understanding the parable. The goal of all this is to get to the teaching point. I need to know the teaching point so I can integrate that and incorporate that back into the main narrative. Because whatever the teaching point is, that's part of the resolution, right? In the larger narrative. So the teaching point here, as I've studied it, there is joyful celebration that exists in heaven when one person repents. Even when there are those who do not sense their need to repent from sin. That is the teaching point that Jesus is trying to make for that one story. That's it right there. So when you look at this, you see parable number 2, verses 8 to 10. I have to do the same process, character, setting, and scene. And then I get down to I do the plot analysis as well, and then I get to my teaching point. The Lord himself expresses joy as his angels stand before him when one person repents. So now I have my second teaching point. Then parable number 3 is the parable of the two sons. It's a more lengthier parable, but again, verses 11 to 32, I do the character analysis, I do setting analysis, scene analysis, and then I get to plot analysis. And so every single story has its own plot, but the plot helps me get to the teaching point. When I know what the teaching point is, which for the third one is Jesus asserts that even though God the Father is brokenhearted over the sinner's choice and lifestyle, he's ready to truly forgive the sinner who truly repents from sin and returns to the Lord, even when others would be critical of this and would despise the Lord for doing this. So I have my 3 teaching points. So then I have to go back to the main narrative, and I have to update the plot analysis of the main story. That's the next step in the procedure. So now what you have to do is you have to update the main plot analysis. See, we looked at the ideally what would have happened right now was looked at each 3 parables, had the 3 teaching points. How does that integrate back? So if I go back to my plot analysis of the main story, not the plot analysis of each individual parable, but the plot analysis of the main story, then you have the opening situation, chapter 15, verse 1, the problem, chapter 15, verse 2. Now you can fill in the gaps of the resolution. Now you can incorporate what you learn from the parables into the resolution, and what you have here are the 3 teaching points. I just copied and pasted the 3 teaching points. That's what you have here. So now, for the plot analysis, it's still only 3 things, but now I have more information. I've incorporated what I learned from the parables into the resolution area of the main plot analysis. Then that helps me go to the level of primary matters. So what is this passage about? It's about joy. It doesn't seem like it with the negativity of the Pharisees, but it's really about joy. The contextual matter is the possibility of salvation. Since the possibility of salvation exists for every sinner, and see, that was the problem of the Pharisees and scribes. They thought that they were the only ones that were worthy enough to be honored by God. No. The possibility of salvation exists for every sinner. We should be joyful, as is our Lord, that God would save every sinner who repents. Because even in spite of those who would complain against his actions, here's the reality, and we learn this from the 3 parables. If you put the first 2 parables together, a joyful celebration exists between God and the angels whenever a sinner repents. Secondly, a joyful celebration exists between God and the sinner. And that's what's typified by the Father and the Son. A joyful celebration exists between God and the sinner whenever that sinner repents. You see, there's joy all around. This is a joyful celebration because of the reestablishment of the relationship. It's all about the relationship between the Lord and the sinner, and the angels are observing that. They're looking at that, which Peter would say that in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 10, 11, and 12. He reiterates the same point that Jesus is making here. So there would be my what, my why, my how. And now, even though it's one chapter, and I may not would preach this in one sermon. Most likely, this would at least be 2 weeks, maybe even a little bit longer, depending on how detailed I want to go through the parables and walk through those parables. But I have my structure now. I took each individual parable, I isolated it, studied it on its own, did character, setting, scene analysis, plot analysis, came up with the 3 teaching points. Then I figured out how to integrate it, how I discovered how it integrates back into the main flow of the narrative. And then that helped me think through the three questions, the what, the why, and the how, the primary matters, and answer those questions. So now I could build a sermon content document from this, is how this works. So again, in class, what we're going to do is go back through this lesson, maybe look at some other parables, kind of get you an idea of how to do this. And when you deal with a parable, you may be only dealing with one at one time, not three. I dealt with this one because I wanted to give you this extreme case as an example. Because if you can do this with three parables, you can do it with one. But you want to think through this in terms of how the procedure works. And so again, we'll have our class together. Make sure you've watched this video and watch it again if you have to. Be ready for our class discussion where we'll go more into these matters and talk about how to think through a parable and understand it and incorporate it into the large flow of the main narrative so you understand what Jesus is trying to say. And so that's how you look at parables.